Hello, how are you today? My name is Susan. I have been drawing at least 20 minutes a day for the last 3 years. And in today's video, I want to share with you a step-by-step guide of how I approach these 20-minute sessions. Step 1, I always assess the boundaries of the drawing, and I try to capture just the rough shape of where things are. And that's usually the shape of the hair, the shape of her face or his face, depending on the model. And kind of capture just the rough starting point and ending point of where I want the drawing to be. I always use very loose lines, almost gestural-like. I would say typically where step 1 ends and where step 2 begins is a little bit blurry, right? Because they're both kind of in the category of roughing out the position of things. The difference is step 1 for me is just the rough outline of where things are. And step 2 is where I start getting into the facial features, the positioning of the nose, the positioning of the mouth, the boundaries of the eyes. Is it pointing upward? Is it looking sideways? Is it looking directly at you? And none of the faces that I've ever drawn, and I've drawn a lot to this point, I would say none of the drawings I've drawn, the face is symmetrical. Even if the model is looking directly at you, they never have the perfect symmetrical face. So that's what makes step 2 really interesting, right? Because if you get this step wrong, then you don't really resemble, whatever you drawn does not really resemble the reference photo. And now that could be your intention, but for my exercises, I always try to make sure that even if I'm not trying super hard to capture the likeness of the model I'm referencing, I at least try to capture the facial expression. Right, so what I mean by that is when you are looking at a reference photo, what kind of feeling are you getting from the model? Is this model happy? Is this model upset? And sometimes that facial expression is very nuanced. The facial expression isn't super clear. Anyway, that's all to say that step 2 is usually where I try to capture at least the resemblance of the likeness of the model by capturing the facial expressions. And then when we're moving on to step 3, I call this step rough shading. This is typically where I spend the longest time, and through shading, I do a number of things. The first thing I do is I capture the darkest regions, things that are just really prominent, and then sometimes I make decisions, right? Maybe I don't have time because I only have 20 minutes. So maybe I don't have time to shade out everything. So I will make a call. I think in this case, I did decide to at least apply some kind of shading to her hair. And I know that the hair is very dark on this model. So a lot of people might look at this reference photo and decide that, oh, I have to make that really dark. For me personally, I actually tend to just blur it out a lot of times, because when I look at this model, the facial expression is what I think is most interesting and not her hair. Her hair is very flat and it's not super interesting to me. So I don't intend on spending a lot of time to clearly depict the hair. So here, I call it rough shading, and I do try my best to find the darkest shapes and I darken them through shading. And I call it rough shading because I really, I don't really care about really nice hatching at this stage, because I do intend to blend it out later in the next step. So what I try to focus on is just darkening the darkest shapes on her face at this point. And then the other thing I try to focus on is adding a little bit more detail to capture the likeness. And you can see that's what I'm doing right now to her eyes, because I wanted to make sure that I capture the fact that her eyes is looking upward to the left, which I think is important to capture in this drawing. And I think the other thing I really like about this reference is that because she's looking up and her face is tilting up, her eyes have this really interesting shape that you usually don't really see in a reference photo. It's kind of like her eye is bulging out a little bit with the shadow, and it's got this like jelly bean look to her eyes, which I find is really interesting to capture. And she's got really pretty features as well. So later on in the blending stage, I really wanted to blend out a lot of the rough-ins that I'm sketching out right now, because I think she has this almost softness to her face that I find that is going to be really powerful once I use blending stump to just blur it out drastically. So that's another reason why I just call it rough shading, because I don't really care about being perfect with my lines. I don't really care about just having really good groups of hatching. Sometimes I do. Sometimes in the rough shading phase, if I want to really have a textured end result, I do try to create really evenly distributed groups of hatching in this stage. But for this one, I know I'm going to do a lot more blending on her face. So I really don't really care in this step to make sure the groups of hatching really make sense. But one of the things that I would say is if you want to practice hatching, definitely try contour hatching. So contouring the face around it and just copy the curvature. That's going to make your sketching look a lot more polished, and it would look a lot more professional than if someone just scribbled on it, which is kind of what I'm doing right now. I think what I'm doing right now is just making it super rough and almost amateur like, I would say. I'm just not paying too much detail around how I'm hatching in this step right now. And then the other thing is, if you're trying to create a evenly shaped region, so you want to just apply the same amount of force, then definitely hold your pencil at the back, which you can see here. If you hold your pencil at the back and you apply sketching over that region, you have a lot more control of creating evenly distributed lines. And if you are applying shading to a smaller region, which I'm doing here, then you will hold the pencil a lot closer, right? And if you are trying to create texture, I would purposefully make sure that you are creating evenly distributed lines and not like a blob of shading as if you're using a color pencil or something like that. But as you can see, sometimes I do kind of use a color pencil technique with this pencil because the lead that I'm using is colored. So it does have that pigment effect. It's very, very soft. So a lot of times I don't apply too much pressure. I don't use it like graphite. If I have a graphite pencil lead that I'm using right now, I would probably go a little bit harder. But because I'm using this pigment-based lead and it's colored, I'm very conscious for around how much pressure I'm applying, to the degree where sometimes I kind of just smudge it, and I really don't want to apply too much pressure because it will break. This lead is so soft, it will break. And as I go along creating this rough shading, I also erase some of the guidelines I had previously that are inaccurate. So in this stage, I'm also correcting some of the boundaries that I created in step 1 and step 2. And as you can see, I use various erasers. The one that I like to use is probably my knead eraser. I just find it to be the most flexible. You could use it to erase very soft lines, no problem at all. You can also shape it and create highlights. And the eraser that I'm using right now, that's I would say like a precision eraser that I use if it's like one single line that I want to erase out. So now we're moving on to step 4, which I call blending and shading. Here I'm using a blending stump. You can use whatever you want. You can use your finger. You can use some tissue paper. I've also seen people just using like wrap your finger around the tissue paper and smudge it out, or wrap a piece of pencil around the tissue paper and then smudge it out. The effect would be very similar to what I'm doing right now. So this blending stump is two-sided. On one side it's a bit chubbier. On the other side, skinnier and more precise, as you can see. And because I've been using this one exclusively with the purple lead that I have here, I actually like the fact that there's some leftover residual pigment on it. So I can almost use it to draw on paper that doesn't actually have any lead. So in this step nowadays, I not only use it to blend out certain regions, I also use it to color some of the places that are just are very soft, and I don't really have any hatching on it yet, as you can see here, where I'm just creating the shading on the forehead. Because this drawing, I would say, sorry, not drawing, this reference photo isn't highly contrasted. Like, there's no harsh shadows on her face. So I actually prefer to use this blending stump to create some of the shadows instead of sketching out everything. One of the techniques I would say to use this blending stump is, if you want a really blended look, you can go from dark to light. But if you don't really want that graceful transition, so for example on her face, there's clearly a darker region at the right hand side, right? So it's very obvious that there's a shape there. So what I wouldn't do is to blend the dark shape into the light shape, because then you're creating almost like a gradient effect, which I don't want, right? So as you can see, a lot of times I'm very conscious around the direction of where I'm starting to blend it. If I want a gradient, I will go from dark to light and then just move in that sweeping position. But if I don't want that, I want to actually create like pretty obvious shapes, and I just want to soften the edge of the shadow a little bit, or soften the hatching lines previously on paper, then what I would do is I would just go back and forth on the dark region itself, right? Because you don't want the dark region or the dark pigment that I already left on paper in the shadow shapes to bleed into the light shape or the mid-tone shape. And then now in step 5, what I'm doing is I'm just adding in more details. So once I finish with blending using that blending stump or your finger, whatever you use, right? I would just go back in with the pencil and add in more details and texture. So maybe through blending, you are now making everything look a little bit more flat. Well, not maybe, almost always, you probably after blending, you've made the drawing look more flat. So now you want to add in more texture, you want to add in a little bit more detail to just make things pop a little bit more. And that's what this step is. I call it refinement and details. You can call it whatever you want. But step 5 is usually, if I'm not too happy about the drawing, it's the step that takes the longest. But if I did everything correctly, this step shouldn't take me that long. So I would say this drawing took me probably less than 20 minutes end to end, because I feel like it was pretty straightforward. I didn't really, I didn't have to go back and erase a whole lot of things or make mistakes on drawing her. So in this step 5, it's pretty straightforward for me, because all I'm doing here is just adding in a little bit more texture back to her face, because although it is very soft, I think my drawing style is just I like to add texture to my sketches. I think adding texture adds a little bit more detail and just makes it look a little bit more interesting. And that's what I'm doing right now. I'm obviously darkening certain regions in this step. And I will also make a call for what is the place I want people to draw their eyes at when they're looking at this drawing, which is kind of like that high contrast area, right? Most of the time, for almost every single portrait drawing, it's the eyes. The eyes is the most interesting, and I think for this drawing in particular, it's also the eyes. I want the eyes to pop. I want that doe-eyed look. And the other thing that I'm trying to do in this step, besides darkening things, adding more detail, is actually correction, right? So when I'm blending things out, I might have made certain regions lighter or flatter. And so what I'm doing now is I'm making sure that the previously defined dark shadow shapes in step 3 are still there, right? So by looking at some of the things I'm noticing is just, it's some of the shapes of the shadow are no longer that obvious. So that's what I'm going back in. And then the other thing I try to create is just contrast. So when I say adding detail, I don't just mean, like add more lines. It's also creating better shapes, right? And creating better shapes, one of the best ways to do that is by creating higher contrast, which you can see. Basically, I'm darkening the boundaries around her face by darkening the shadow or the hair, right? And what that does is it really makes her face pop. And what this creates is just a more polished and interesting looking face for the viewer. So what do you think? How do you like this? Maybe you want to give it a go? Follow along and let me know.